If I've done that, I'll just be incredibly proud.
Hello and welcome. You're watching Lockdown TV from UnHerd. So in the past few hours, a judgment was handed down from an employment tribunal here in England, which concerned the case of Maya Forstater, and was one of the most talked about cases of the past couple of years. And she joins us now live to tell us all about it. Hi, Maya.
Hi, Freddie.
So give us the kind of headline for anyone who hasn't received the BBC News alert already. What happened in this judgment?
So the original judgment was overturned. The original judgment was that gender critical beliefs are not worthy of respect in a democratic society, and that was overturned. So it was found that gender critical beliefs are worthy of respect, and therefore people who hold them are protected from discrimination and harassment, both at work, but it will also apply as customers, as public service users, as members of associations and political parties. So it's really, really widespread. It's a landmark judgment.
So this will actually establish a precedent, just like any other court ruling that other courts are going to have to observe. So I think probably what we have to do is explain what gender critical beliefs means, because people won't know what that means. So let's rewind, if it's okay with you, right back to the start of 2019. So you are at that point working for a think tank, you're a researcher, and you write a paper and an article about self-identification.
Towards the end of 2018, about October 2018, I was working at a think tank, not on gender and sex. I was working on international tax, but I'd been paying attention to the debates around self-ID, the government's proposal to allow people to change their legal sex just by making a declaration, and there was a consultation going on. And so I'd been following this debate, and I could see that it was, quite difficult to talk about, and people were scared about talking about it. And I thought, I work at a think tank, which is all about people exchanging ideas and disagreeing with each other. And I had about 2,000 followers on Twitter. And so I thought, I should be able to be part of this debate. And so I tweeted, some quite carefully worded tweets about, you should contribute to this government consultation. Here's something to read. It was very carefully worded. And then I had also tweeted about things that were in the newspaper. So Karen White, the male sex offender who was put in a women's prison and who went on to assault female prisoners. I tweeted about a man called Philip Bunce, who works at Credit Suisse and who on Fridays comes to work in a dress and a wig, and had been given an award by the FT as a top woman in business. So I'd sort of been tweeting about the issue, but also, some examples of individual people. And it got, I worked for a think tank in London, but their headquarters is in Washington, DC. And I think a couple of members of staff in Washington, DC saw my tweets and felt uncomfortable and complained.
I have to interrupt you there because I did take the liberty of looking up the think tank. It's called the Centre for Global Development, and listed right there are the funders of the think tank. And there's a lot of money from the Gates Foundation. There's a lot of money from I think they're called Moskowitz family, which were one of the Facebook founders. So, without wishing to feel conspiracist about it, it does have the hallmark of that kind of elite, big tech associated progressive American opinion that is sort of trying to establish orthodoxies at the moment.
Yes, I think that's right. And as I understand it, the two people who raised concerns in Washington worked in fundraising. Although I don't think the concerns came directly from funders, I'm sure that was in their mind. And there were no complaints that I harassed anybody. There were no trans people in the office. So I think probably indirectly that sort of concern of what would the funders think.
So it's another American import for
yes.
us. So what happened next, Maya?
So what happened next was they emailed. So HR in Washington, DC emailed me and said that we don't vet. So it was my personal Twitter account, but obviously, I tweet about stuff I'm working on, but it is my personal Twitter account. And so they emailed me from Washington and they said, we don't vet staff and associates social media, but we ask them not to use exclusionary language. And they said there'd been some concerns, and they said, could I put a disclaimer on my tweets that, all views my own? So I replied and I said, yes, of course. And I said that I would always treat people politely. I would use anyone's preferred pronouns, in work or at a conference, or anytime I, came into contact with a trans person professionally or socially. I didn't want to be rude or make anyone feel uncomfortable, but I did want to talk about the topic. And I would continue to say that trans women are not women. Men cannot become women. And if that offends people, then they will be offended. But it's true and it's important. So I said all of this in the email in an organization where I assumed that they would stand up for people having differences of views, because it was the kind of place that wasn't about enforcing orthodoxies. It has a policy that it doesn't take organizational positions. It's happy to disagree with each other on all kinds of things, but it turned out not on this thing.
And then it progressed, and you continued to write about it, and eventually they sacked you. Is that?
Pretty much. I mean, I don't say sacked because I wasn't handed a P45, because I wasn't on a full-time contract at the time, but I was working on a project where we were developing a larger project. So, my CV was in the proposal. I'd developed part of the proposal. I'd talked to the funders. And the idea was, when the funding was agreed, I would then, get the job to do the work, which is sort of a normal thing in the NGO world and think tanks. So I was sort of expecting that when the proposal was agreed, I would then do the work. And at the point where the proposal was agreed, they said, actually, no, we don't. Well, first they said, we won't ask you to do it on an employment contract, but could you continue and do it on a consultancy contract as a visiting fellow? So a more arm's length relationship, which was what I'd already had. And so I said yes. And then that visiting fellowship had to be agreed by the senior leadership team. And there were some concerns in the senior leadership team. So then they said, oh, well, could you do it just as a consultant with no title, no email, no business cards, no,
invisibly.
Invisibly. And I said, at that point, I said, I'll think about it, because, I didn't think it was a good offer, but I didn't want to say no, or yes. I just said, I'll think about it. And then a day later, I got an email from them saying goodbye.
So at that point, I mean, I guess in the days leading up to that, you're aware that you've kind of touched on this incredibly sensitive topic. And a lot of people at that point would have backtracked and sort of said, this might lose me my job. I'm not going to talk about this anymore. Why at that point did you stick to your guns?
I think it's just the person I am. And, the way that I'd got the job in the first place was by arguing with CGD over something that they'd got wrong about international tax. And I'd taken a position which was uncomfortable for some of, for the NGOs that are campaigning on international tax. And CGD hired me on that basis and sort of backed me up when I, when people would say, why are you employing somebody who's not agreeing with the party line? And they backed me up.
So you thought they liked you being an independent thinker?
Yes, I mean, I really did. And I think there are parts of the organisation that did. But, on this topic, it sort of gave in to the corporate machine. So partly that's the kind of person I am.
What was the reaction like? You endured quite a backlash on social media and so on, didn't you? Tell us what happened.
So what happened was so I lost my job March 6, 2019. And I didn't realize, I didn't know anything about belief discrimination. I didn't even think that I would have a case, but I tweeted that I'd lost my job. And there were feminist lawyers that were sort of waiting for a test case. They had this idea about belief discrimination, and they had their eye out to see that there are lots of people losing jobs, and they were looking for a test case. So then I took CGD to Employment Tribunal, and I had to launch the crowdfunder for that. So that's when I really first came into public knowledge, although it was, now looking back, it was quite calm compared to after JK Rowling. So there's been sort of this whole thing's been.
So JK Rowling then tweeted in support of you and mentioned you in her long piece.
After I lost the Employment Tribunal, then JK Rowling tweeted about it, and then it became an international news story. So my Twitter follows have gone up like that, and the amount of abuse and
what sort of abuse do you get? I mean, what is it they say?
Just cartoon guns pointed at you, you're hateful scum, you're just all of that kind of stuff, mainly from sort of anonymous people with anime profiles. So I don't pay too much attention to it, but I've had things from barristers saying you are a bigot, for example, and saying your language and your tweets leads to self-harm and leads to people killing themselves from barristers, and that that was quite shocking to me. But anonymous people behaving badly on the internet, there's not a lot you can do about that, but named professionals saying those kinds of things is quite shocking.
So let's actually look into what your transgression actually was. I was going to say your crime, but obviously that's the wrong phrase. And if it was, you've been acquitted of it today. So what you believed and was saying openly is that there is a difference between the sexes, and that a man can't become a woman just by believing they are so, even if they've had surgery. Is that the sum of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's the ordinary belief about the sexes that I think, if you ask your mum or your grandma, or any scientist that's willing to be honest, it's the basic belief about the sexes. And
the reason most people don't think about this, in fact, there's a lot of discussion at the moment, is the culture war imaginary? Is it exaggerated? Is it real? Most people don't come into contact with this question, and it feels quite a sort of academic question. What are we arguing about transgender bathrooms, or what's the latest controversy? Why do you think it's important? What are the things that it could actually affect that you think are worth fighting for?
I think it's particularly important for women's rights, because it's women who are harmed the most when organisations pretend that sex doesn't exist. So, most of public life, most of workplaces are mixed sex, and you should treat men and women the same. But where you have provisions to treat men and women differently, it's usually to protect women. So you have female sports, you have women's sports, because if you didn't, there'd be no women in the Olympics, there'd be no women in athletics. You have separate sex. I mean, bathrooms is important. You have changing rooms, you have bathrooms that are separate sex for the dignity and privacy of both men and women, but particularly for women, because voyeurism and exposure are really, really common crimes, and they're done by men to women. So, making it absolutely unambiguous who's allowed into a space where women are undressing is important. And then similarly, women's refuges, women's prisons, they are sex segregated for a reason, and usually that reason protects women.
There's also an interesting interplay with the gay rights controversy, isn't there? Because if you argue that there is no difference between the sexes, then someone who is only attracted to the same sex doesn't theoretically exist.
Yes, and I think lots of organisations are approaching this thinking, we were very late to the party on gay rights. We didn't think about how to treat gay people the same as straight people in terms of employment benefits and so on. And now we want to make that right and not make that same mistake again. And there's the kind of ghost of Section 28, where schools were not allowed to teach about gay relationships. And so there's a sort of response to that, which is, well, this time we're going to get it right. This time we're not going to make those mistakes. But as you say, if you don't accept that there's a difference between men and women, then what does it mean to be gay or lesbian? And lesbian friends tell me that like 40% of the profiles on lesbian dating sites are male. And it's like a bad joke, of a man saying I'm a lesbian trapped in a man's body. But they're being subjected to that in their spaces and their dating sites and their groups, and they're being told that if they don't accept that someone can be a lesbian in a man's body, then that they're a bigot.
So how far do you think it's gone? You talk about these organizations who have either they've hired consultants to come in and do training, or they've got programs to educate people, is normally the verb you hear. How far do you think it's gone? I mean, is it just a few government agencies and trendy kind of corporations, or do you think it's lots and lots of organizations in our country?
I think it's very widespread. So Stonewall says that it covers 25% of the UK workforce amongst it. So it has this Stonewall Diversity Champions scheme where organisations sign up to Stonewall, pay them a few £1,000s a year and get rated by them. And so they're basically paying to be lobbied. And they have 850 members, which includes lots of big corporations, law firms, major government departments, hospital, NHS trusts, police, housing associations. So you kind of look down the list, and Stonewall, disagreed with me in this case. They think that gender critical views should not be protected against discrimination and harassment, and they have influence over all of these parts of life. And I sort of looked down the list, and I could imagine being a graduate going out for thinking about where I could get a job, and how could you possibly disagree with that when when all of the major employers are signed up to it? And my employer wasn't signed up to Stonewall, but they're part of that wider influence.
So it comes in through the sort of HR department, through the administrative level of these organizations. They bring in agencies like Stonewall, and suddenly people can't really join the organization after that unless they have a particular set of what are considered morally acceptable beliefs.
Yes. And, Stonewall started out as a gay rights organization, and the Stonewall Diversity Champion scheme has been going on for quite a long time. And when it first started out, it was sort of basics of gay rights in the workplace. So in some cases, organizations have been signed up for it for a long time, and each year the goalposts are moved. And they just haven't thought about how does this impact on women, and how does it impact on freedom of speech, and then they can't get out of it. And one of the things that it asked them to do is set up affinity groups, so the LGBTQ plus allies group, who then sort of vet internal policies and make complaints about people and do reverse mentoring of senior managers. So there's, they do the sort of thought policing within the organization. So that's now very strongly embedded. And I've heard from people since I started the case, and then we've set up a human rights organization, Sex Matters. I hear from lots of people inside organizations that have these policies, and they talk about the Stonewall Stasi in their organization.
So is your hope then that today's judgment is a turning point in some way? And your case, I mean, frankly, hearing you, I can see why they wanted to back you as a perfect example here, because you're so self-evidently thoughtful and not kind of reactionary crazy. Do you feel like you might be kind of leading the way for other people to be braver about saying what they really think?
I hope so. I really hope so. If I've done that, I'll just be incredibly proud. And I think, the fact that both discrimination and harassment are now protected means that organizations are going to have to think, hold on a second, what does this policy mean for the people who are affected by it, not just for the trans people? And, when they get complaints in, one thing that organizations are really scared of, I think, is saying, no, that's not transphobia, because it's defined that saying, no, that's not transphobia is transphobic. And so nobody within the organization will say, no, hold on a second, that's just somebody disagreeing with you. And so that's how these things escalate, because nobody is willing. They know that if they say, that seems perfectly reasonable to me, they will then have the fingers pointed at them. So being able to push back against that is really important.
In terms of the goal, what you want to see, it's not that you want this whole movement of trying to kind of make people more aware of minority issues. You don't want to remove it entirely. You just want to adapt it to be more kind of pluralist and less sort of one-sided. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, it's come to a point where you hear diversity and equality and you think, oh God, they're out to get me. And that's not what it should be. Equality should be protecting everybody's rights, including, people's right to disagree with each other. And I think moving this issue into the religion and belief sort of box is helpful, because it's helpful for how we think about this. In a plural society, we know that people can go to work and you can have Sikhs and Muslims and Christians and atheists working alongside each other, and they ought to be able to get on and be polite and not use the other person's religion to harass them. But at the same time, they don't have to give it so much respect that they are required to say things that they don't believe.
I suppose one slight hesitation I have is this idea that it was a philosophical belief. So the legal defense was that you would be discriminated against for having the philosophical belief that men and women were different, almost as if it's a sort of abstract, kooky, but hey, it's her religion, so, don't touch it.
Yeah.
Is there any sense in which that sets a new dangerous precedent?
I don't think so. I mean, we had to plead it that way because religion and belief is protected. And the thing that we pleaded was that my belief is that sex is real, biological, immutable, and that sex matters. And that's the important part, that it's not just that it's a kind of scientific fact, but also that it's a social and political and economic salient, important thing. And there are some people who don't believe that. And, if you sort of talk enough with them, they will say, yes, I understand sex is real, but I think gender identity is more important. So that's the kind of the split. But it was quite important that the judgment said a lot of things. And one of the things that it clarified was that in law, sex is binary. Sex is male and female. And, some people think it's a spectrum, and some people think people can be non-binary. But in UK law, that's not recognised. And so people can believe all kinds of things, but we know that the science says women get pregnant, women are female, and there are different reproductive roles for males and females, and those are reflected in law. So it's not that everyone can have their own rules, but everyone can have their own beliefs. And then where you have rules that are there for people's safety or for medical information or the census, those rules, still have to be grounded in reality. We're not sort of giving everything away.
So you don't think, for example, if I'm a Muslim parent in Batley and Spen, and I'm not happy about my child receiving either sex education classes or being taught that homosexuality is not a sin, for example, is there no danger I now say, well, hey, Maya Forstater had a philosophical belief that was defended. I want mine too. Could there be unforeseen complications out of this?
This judgment should help to make those kinds of debates kind of clearer and saner, rather than at the moment, I think people look at them and all they can say is, well, who are the goodies and who are the baddies? This
will hopefully allow the discussion to take place.
Yes, exactly. And to really look at what is the content of sex education, because, you can put all kinds of things into sex education which are not age appropriate and which are not helpful for children. And, the Department for Education has said that schools should not be teaching that children can be born in the wrong body, and that if a child doesn't feel comfortable with sex stereotypes, or wants to, if a boy wants to wear a dress, that you should transition them. All of that has been put into sex education. So, as you said, in the workplace, it's come in through HR, but in schools, a lot of it has come in through sex education. And in the same way that, schools and education authorities kind of previously didn't do sex education well and were discriminatory towards, anything other than sort of nuclear families, they've pushed back the other way towards a kind of anything goes in sex education. So I think, it's another area where we have to open the box and say, how are children's rights being protected here?
So they need to not be taboos. They need to not be untouchable areas. We need to be able to discuss them without fear of retribution.
Yeah. And people who challenge them shouldn't be seen as just, well, they must be bad, they must be bigots.
So you've got this judgment today. What does it mean for you? I mean, does that mean you're now entitled to a compensation of some kind?
So there are three things that could happen. One is my ex-employer could appeal this judgment. So this was the preliminary hearing of this case. So it was just to know, is this belief in principle protected? And so they could challenge this, and then it would go on to the Court of Appeal, or we could carry on with the case and it goes back to the employment tribunal to hear the rest of the case, which is, how did I lose my job? How was I employed? What were those circumstances? Or they could settle.
So if you are somebody in a workplace or a school or any of these organizations, as of today, you can say out loud without fear of retribution that you think men and women are different and that sex is real.
Yes. And you can look at your organization's policies and say, do these policies discriminate against people with my view? In which case they should change the policy. So I think, there's a lot of work to be done to unpick this from institutions. And that's why I've co-founded Sex Matters as a human rights organization to protect people who have this belief, which is the belief that most people have, and to challenge organizational capture.
Have you heard from JK yet?
She sent a congratulatory DM.
Good. Well, we're awaiting her tweet. Can't be long now.
No, well, she did. She's retweeted it. So I tweeted this morning, and she has retweeted it.
Okay. Well, if you message her, we'll be happy to have her on the show as well. Maya Forstater, congratulations on the result, and thanks for coming on today.
Thank you.
That was Maya Forstater, a former researcher and now become something of a celebrity activist in the field of gender critical thinking, which is a fancy name for the belief that men and women exist and are different, and that sex exists and matters. So we'll see what happens after today's important verdict, but thanks to her for sharing her story, and thanks for watching. This was Lockdown TV.